Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Centre for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI as we say. My name is Fred Kuntz, and I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs here at CIGI. I'd like to thank our public event sponsors, Wordsworth Books, for their ongoing support of CIGI's signature lecture series. Thanks also to those joining us from around the world through our live webcast this evening. Following the address, we welcome questions from both audiences here at CIGI at the microphones on either side of the aisle, or from our online audience through the chat function on your screen. Please remember to state your name and to keep the questions brief. Here in Canada, after a winter of record-breaking lows and a snowy start to spring, we've all developed a deep appreciation for our electricity and gas providers. It's hard to imagine life without certainty of energy to meet our basic needs, including heat. Tonight, our speaker looks beyond Western borders to consider energy challenges and opportunities in developing countries, where clean and abundant energy is not a sure thing. Professor Gerald or Jed Davis is the chair of the World Energy Scenario Study Group, as well as president and CEO of Forseen. He's been a strong proponent for the development and use of global scenarios to help develop policies for the future. He holds an undergraduate degree in mining engineering from Imperial College in London, as well as postgraduate degrees in economics and engineering from the London School of Economics and Stanford University, respectively. Please join me in welcoming tonight's special guest, Jed Davis.
Well, first, let me thank you for those kind words. It's tremendous to be here. Every time I come through Waterloo, there's something new. Is get this sense of change and excitement, and it's a good place to be. So what I'd like to do is, over the next 50 minutes or so, give you a sense of this exercise, the Global Energy Assessment, why I believe it's important, and really what it's about, the highlights, and some of the consequences of it. Let me first talk a little bit about the word assessment. We don't have a lot of experience doing large-scale assessments. We have the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Some of you may have seen some of the results from Working Group 2, the 5th assessment, which is really beginning to report at the moment. We do have, besides the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which was looking at biodiversity in the longer term. Again, a major study. There is a study which perhaps less seen, but important, on the International Assessment of Agricultural Knowledge, Science and Technology. And the Global Energy Assessment is such a creature. It involves a large-scale set of teams working for many years, trying to provide at least a comprehensive and collective set of insights around a subject area which matters in quite significant ways. It has a number of unique elements. It is not intergovernmental in the sense that every word is agreed by governments. It's much more a peer-reviewed exercise, which is quite unique. Every single chapter is reviewed by a peer group. So overall in this work, there were some 300 researchers worldwide and 200 reviewers. And secondly, its uniqueness derives from the fact that it is normative in nature. It's trying to ask the question, if we want to manage energy intelligently through this century, whether it's the issue of security of energy supply, affordability, whether we're dealing with the issues around climate change, addressing the issues of air pollution and energy access for all, what really is the information we need, the knowledge we need to provide a sound foundation for intelligent decision-making. So that was really the objective. Overriding or acting as the sort of senior governance group was a set of people deliberately selected to provide some balance between the developed and the developing world, 2 co-presidents, one from Europe, the other from Brazil, a range of governments, international institutions, and representatives from a diverse set of countries, be it China, be it Austria, and so on. This information you can look at your leisure. It was funded, significant funding from a range of governments here, particularly a set of international institutions and a number of companies like First Solar, Petrobras in Brazil, and supported by the World Energy Council and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, which are both organizations with substantial private sector involvement. Let me say a little bit about what are the key features of this work. It was conducted very much in the mode of scientific analysis. It was science-based, comprehensive, integrated, policy-relevant analysis. It recognized right at the outset the multiple objective challenge of dealing with energy. When you make a decision that addresses, for example, a power plant decision, be it coal or gas, and be it increasingly maybe a set of wind turbines or perhaps solar plants. Every time you make a decision which might be related to achieving security, it affects pollution in the system, the cost of the system. It affects questions of affordability, a range of issues. So we have here a quite complex set of issues. Particular focus was around the energy and sustainability challenges that energy poses. In a world which is changing dramatically its set of options for technology and reassessing continuously the fundamental resource base. It's a world in which even the demand and supply fundamentals are changing, particularly on the demand side, as new technologies allow us to use energy more economically, allow us to open up possibilities which we would not have thought of even a decade or two ago in terms of use, be it electric vehicles, be it other possibilities. It's a world that's beginning to get into a fundamental set of new systemic issues. How do we handle large-scale off-grid systems? If we have a system of energy supply which is built around intermittent sources, what sort of storage is needed? How do we control in real time these sort of systems integration issues? And finally, we will look at the possible futures, learn a little bit about how the world might be to help inform us about policy options in the present, and look much more carefully at intelligent options going forward. The output of the work, and what we see here is a table of contents. It's a large piece of work. It's built around what we call 4 knowledge clusters. You can see them here in cluster 1, 2, 3, and 4. Initially, cluster 1 is dealing very much with the nature and magnitude of the challenges and expresses them in terms of specific numbers. So you'll see, excuse me, danger of pressing the laser pointer. So you can see here the challenges. They're around health and security, issues of economy, energy and environment, issues of poverty and development. Secondly, what we're dealing with are the existing and future resource and technology options. Our ability to address these issues obviously depends on the tools that we have available. And here we're dealing with a wide range of issues. I'm not going to go through them in detail here because I'm going to cover quite a few of these as we go forward. Thirdly, there's a synthesis section. Having got this information out, what we're looking at here is their integration. And this includes not just energy, but will necessarily touches on issues of land use, water, urbanization, lifestyles, and then looking at the possible future pathways that we need to think about in looking at the consequence of policy and possibilities. And finally, if we go towards the end, a series of chapters that deal with our analysis of existing policies and new policies needed to address the challenges we have at the moment. This is an ambitious document led by a group of some 25 experts from around the world, included, in fact, here from Canada, Mark Jaccard, head of the Policy for Energy System Transformations at Simon Fraser. But what we had was a wide set of experts. This 25 had on average teams of around 12 and labored on this for a number of years before the work was completed. The aim was to get not just competence, but to recognize we needed a degree of diversity in the groups involved. And although you see a significant emphasis on OECD, increasingly we're looking at non-OECD involvement. And in a way, this was a more than adequate reflection of the available expertise globally on addressing energy. So if we just close a little bit on a few points on this work, it was not just a report, a rather large report. It weighs around 5.5 kilos, some 1,850 documents. The good news that every single chapter is downloadable separately, and more importantly, for those who are involved in doing analytical work, a large database is accessible and usable for those people who want to dig deeper into the work. The whole idea was to have elements of an open source structure for this work. Secondly, there's a series of policy tools which allow policies to be constructed and examined, looking at trade-offs between different issues. If you don't want to do anything, say, in addressing resilience issue and security, or you think climate change is not a concern, you can play with this to look at different policy sets and policy options. And it's a little bit like doing test work before you get involved in making decisions. 300 authors, 200 reviewers, cost around €6 million, and a large document. But as I say, importantly, if you go to the website at the top here, that website, www.globalenergyassessment.org, you can download just about everything with respect to the report. So let me turn now to the content. When we talk about the global energy goal, we're looking here at addressing climate change, at the time focusing on what needed to be done to limit mean temperature rise to 2 degrees centigrade, looking at improving energy security across countries, eliminating air pollution, health damages, providing universal access to affordable clean cooking and electricity for the poor. In effect, a rather wide range of goals here. And it's perhaps worth reminding ourselves where the global energy system has come from. It doesn't stay the same. It changes, and it changes radically as our technology sets change, the costs of extraction and use of energy changes, and it changes as our resource base shifts and changes. If you go back to the middle of the 19th century, what we see here is the development and the beginnings, perhaps going back some distance, but the steam engine was a significant and dominant tool. It was really towards the end of the 19th century that we began to develop the electric motor and the gasoline engine. And we've seen other developments through the vacuum tube, commercial aviation, nuclear, the microchip. And what we've seen is a gradual shift in energy use from carbon intensity, carbon intense wood and then coal, right through to crude oil becoming significant and its products. Coal as a share began to peak in the 1920s, oil in the 1960s, 70s, and we've seen a substantial growth in gas and, of course, a growth in nuclear with its problems, and a fairly modest role for renewables. This is where we've come from. This is the picture that's probably worth at some point to keep in one's head. So all of the variety of energy use that you see if you look at the way energy is used around the world is embedded in a way in that particular diagram. So let me talk a little bit about, in rather general terms initially, about the real challenge of fossil fuel in the context of climate change. Let's be very clear to start off with. We have enormous amounts of fossil fuel, enough to meet our requirements for many centuries. Let's have a look, first of all, at the climate issue. The present atmosphere has something over, in the order of around 3,000 gigatons of CO2. That is a growth from the pre-industrial level of 2000. We've had historical emissions of 1,900 gigatons of CO2, and if you add these two numbers up, they're substantially larger than this, and that's really for a very simple reason, that not all the CO2 that's been emitted since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution is up in the atmosphere. And you can say that if you want to maintain 2 degrees centigrade, you've got about another room to put up in the atmosphere, another 850, maybe 1,000 gigatons of CO2. Some people call this the trillion ton cap, to use the snazzy term. So that seems like a lot. But let's have a look at, let's translate our understanding of fossil fuel resources into gigatons of CO2. Well, you could easily, in many of these areas, unconventional oil, natural gas, unconventional gas, which includes shale, you could easily burn up a small portion of that and you would be close to the 850 gigatons of CO2. If you want to go to 3 degrees centigrade, you might be able to add another 1,000 gigatons of CO2 and accept what might be the consequences of that. Equally, if we look at coal amounts to around 30,000 gigatons of CO2. If we look at some of the earlier estimates of gas hydrates, essentially methane that's held within particular structures which have water associated, but they're beginning to be worked on, particularly early work in Japan and South Korea, since there are large resources between the two countries in the sea, between 6,600 and 57,000. And if you want to look at some of the longer term estimates, we're looking at around 100,000 tons. Very clearly, even if you have difficulty with the science around climate change, it's very clear we have some interesting challenges about which parts of this enormous potential energy source we want to use. Where are we focusing our interests? Well, at the moment around natural gas and conventional gas, crude oil because of the transport needs, some unconventional oil, some biomass, small amounts are used in the large. So we have quite a challenge there. When you look at the sort of futures, and I want to spend a few moments on the types of futures we need to think about for energy, what we find when we look at CO2 output, what we're looking at here are a class of futures where we begin to run down the gigaton CO2 output if you want to remain within the 2 degrees centigrade. And what we're looking at, typically when we look at the profile, we get a peaking. If you want that peak to take place later, then you've either got to come down more sharply in the middle, and you have to look at negative CO2 emissions longer term, and there are technologies available to consider that. So this is the challenge. And if you want to go to 3 degrees centigrade, or 4, or 5, or 6, what we're looking at is you have more scope to go to higher peaks and come down more slowly. And therefore, the adjustment process for the global energy system is going to be different. But it's constrained around this sort of picture. This work, in its look at the future, looked at some 60 different worlds going forward to try to understand the possibility to use the resource base in ways that meet a set of multiple objectives that I covered at the beginning or fairly early on in the review of the content, the multiple objectives. The classes of futures looked at were a set of futures which are very much focused on large-scale improvements in efficiency. And we will spend a lot of time in the remainder of this talk to talk about what we can do and how the demand side, which tends to be neglected, provide some fundamental clues as to the type of policies that can work going forward. Secondly, we'll look at, in particular, supply, technology push. So much of the discussions around energy tend to focus on energy sources and their development, which is just one side of the energy equation. And thirdly, we'll spend little time in this presentation on it, but there is a series of regional diversity questions because different parts of the world have different energy resources, different demands, and we need to examine them in more detail. So if we look at the stylized, I want to give you a sense of stylized futures, which are maybe a little bit different from the futures we tend to see. The point about efficiency futures is that what we're looking at here is a world that might be looking at maybe double the rate of efficiency improvements that we've historically had. Historically, we've seen energy productivity improvements of around, on average, 1.2% per annum. We have examples, periods where it could be as high as 2 and as high as 2.4%. And that's the sort of world we're looking at. There are many elements, and I won't go into it in detail here, that shape energy use, but quite obviously, and it depends where you are and how you live, different consumption behaviors, the role of mobility. There's no doubt that if you live in and around Toronto, I guess a car is pretty much a necessity. But there are many parts of the world, I take Europe as an example, where people can live adequately and more than adequately and do not have cars because of the quality of public transport and other options that exist, the design of cities, and so on. In this area, there's just probably one thing to emphasize here. If you build a world which focuses on much more efficient energy use, you open up an enormously wider range of options to decide what sort of energy supply works for you. On the other hand, the more normal way of thinking about energy is to focus on the supply side and look at the technologies and their possibilities. And here, as we will see, on the technology side, technology push side, those sorts of futures are much less flexible. If we lose technology source, for example, nuclear, now in parts of Europe, nuclear in Japan, and we suddenly lose a major supply source, it's not easy to handle the normal sorts of energy demand when we have average efficiency improvements. And thirdly, when we're looking at mixes, I won't go into this, there's a series of heterogeneous, different types of futures to look at. So let me talk about the stylized demand side, what it actually looks like. And here I'm going to deal with futures that go out to 2100. You can see here, first of all, a large gray component. That gray component is very much concerned about how we can improve productivity and efficiency of energy use. Secondly, we're looking at a much larger role for renewables, and we'll go into that in some detail in a few moments. Thirdly, phasing out oil, and it's phased out in part because there are other alternatives that are developed. It takes some time, may take up to 50 to 100 years, depending on the sort of futures, but there is a transformational change taking place there. And there is a role for fossil fuels, but that is related to a world in which carbon capture and storage has a particular role. When we look at the range of futures, and you can see on the bottom here, you have to turn your head to see it, but I'll make it easier. I'll tell you what's there. First of all, we're looking at two classes of futures. Advanced transportation are futures where over time, this century, we're looking at a gradual displacement of those oil products that go into transport based on crude oil being replaced over time by electricity options. That takes time, and there are certain sectors of the transportation sector which are more difficult to address than others. But what you see when we're looking at the GEA efficiency futures, rapid energy intensity improvement, that and these lines here are different pictures of where we are in 2050. What we're looking at are all of these as being feasible. We can drop out something like nuclear. We can look at futures, if I run through the bottom side here, we can look at futures without nuclear, without a fairly limited bioenergy. We can look at futures with no carbon capture and storage, even no nuclear and no carbon capture and storage. We have a lot of flexibility for building a global energy supply picture which can handle both advanced transportation options and conventional transportation futures. If we turn to the supply side, and this is much more characteristic of the sort of futures we tend to look at, fairly modest savings across the norm. What we're looking at here, large-scale developments because of the restrictions of new energy supply forms. Solar has a particularly strong role. There was probably be a real need for nuclear in here, particularly when one looks at Asian developments and the strong set of developments. We see it in places like China, South Korea, still in terms of nuclear development. What we're looking at, modest efficiency and rapid upscaling of supply options. This is a world that's very intense. It's an expensive world. We need to build a lot of new energy plant and energy systems because there's a very much ongoing set of demands here as particularly developing countries become developed. So there's a real challenge on these supply-side futures. And when you ask yourself what is feasible there, what you notice immediately is there are large gaps. Most conventional transportation futures are difficult to see exactly how we would, with known technologies, meet their requirements. And to a lesser extent, that's true with advanced transportation. So I think with that in mind, I want to talk a little bit about the details and perhaps down at a level which we, in general, are much more comfortable with. I want to focus particularly around the demand side. In a world that is going urban, we expect by 2050 that maybe 75% of the world's people will be in cities. And cities have very particular energy needs, which are quite different from the average pictures that we see. Cities have large embodied energy elements. A lot of the things we use in cities come from outside the city. And that is an important issue, because when we look at the footprints of the urban dweller, we don't see all of it if we just take their current intake of energy on an ongoing basis, whether for heating or cooling, whether for the mobility needs within a city. So embodied energy matters, and one needs to think about that. I think secondly, we have, particularly if, for example, on the Asian seaboard, significant air pollution issues. These are air pollution and congestion issues. And they need to be addressed in significant ways. And that is almost a current and topical set of issues. I think thirdly, we know from quite a lot of studies that you can go a long way in reshaping energy use in cities by much more efficient buildings, by looking at urban density and form elements, changing the layout of cities. We know that you can do quite a lot with optimizing distributed energy, and we know if you have integrated policies, you can really go a long way. It's quite astonishing how far we could go if we had the capacity to go. And I think what's particularly important here is what we call the governance paradox. The largest leverage from systems design of cities and their energy use comes from integrated approach. But it's extremely difficult from a governance standpoint to get the sort of integration that we need to do that. If we go into the elements of energy use, it's worth reminding ourselves that pretty close to a third of all energy simply goes into supplying energy to buildings. It can be in a range of uses. You're more than familiar with them. I guess this is a country where you have more than your fair share of heating, and familiar with the challenges of air conditioning in the summer, challenges. We know from a very wide range of studies that we can build housing and retrofit housing to handle energy needs and demands, comfortable energy use, with only 10% of the current energy input that we see. We know equally when we do studies, you can go really a long way in both accounting for the increasing floor space that will be needed, and at the same time radically reduce the overall energy use if we use state-of-the-art technologies and begin to work on that on a continual basis through to 2050. Much is possible. If we look at, and I won't spend much time on this, at the detailed analysis of where energy can be saved and the overall savings alongside the investment requirements to retool the global housing stock, for a cost of, it sounds large, of around $14 to $15 trillion, we can look at savings based on current estimates of around $50 to $60 trillion. A very good investment. However, and the challenge in a way is, although we have enormous potential, this is one of those areas where we have a range of barriers to implementation. The classic problem that what the landlord wants in some countries is not the same as what the tenant wants. There's lock-in risk. If we move too quickly on current technology, because of the length of life of buildings, we run the risk of not doing as well as we could do if we built buildings which have a quick and easy opportunity to be retrofitted. I think it's probably fair to say that we have many examples of how to do this well around the world, and it's very clear from studies that are beginning to be done, and many are in this report, you can see the summary, that there's a lot of potential for policy developments that can encourage improvement of energy use in cities. We talk of cities, and we talk of demand side, and we talk of buildings, but it's worth recognizing that in other areas, for example, if we look at industry, we've got a range of activities that we can get into, retrofitting existing plants, new technologies, optimizing systems, lifestyle product design, a whole range of possibilities that would lead to significant efficiency improvements beyond the norm. Residential, I made reference to a few moments ago, but it's equally true in the development of the vehicle. There's enormous potential to take what is, on some reckonings, a technology when you look at how much energy there is at the, as it were, applied to the road, which is really at times measured in less than 10%. So lots of options, lots of possibilities. Demand side is worthy of consideration. So we can do quite a lot on the demand side. Let me turn now to the options around, which many talk about the role of non-fossils. Well, as we know well, fossils themselves are derived from material that has been, as it were, imbued with solar energy, but historically, old plants, what have you. The reality is, of course, there's an enormous amount of radiation that we could potentially access. Put simply, the amount of solar energy that's available on Earth is estimated at around 3 million exajoules per year. Think of that 3 million figure. It's many times the present use of around 500. So there's a lot that we can envisage doing to access that energy in different ways. A critical issue, and I apologize for not going through this in great detail. Again, you'll have to go to the report. But absolutely central and critical here is the cost of technology and the way it develops over time. If we take, for example, let's hope I can get this laser pointer. If you take this yellow line here, what we're looking at are solar PV modules. There's an enormously powerful experience of reduced costs that have taken place as the volumes in the industry have moved forward. We'll touch on that in a moment. If you look at PV systems, the systems as opposed to the module, what we're looking at are really much less learning. Some quite interesting issues. You normally expect learning to lead to lower costs, but in some areas like French and US power stations, as we've developed nuclear, we've found there are additional costs that need to be borne, safety reasons, public concerns, refitting systems. As I say, I won't go through this, but the normal expectation that learning leads to lower costs also isn't true everywhere. If we look at the current role of renewables, if we look at it on a substitution basis, if we were to fill this, the energy supplied from renewables by fossils, you'd need to think of around about 17% of this current use of energy, supply or demand for energy. I think what's important to recognize here is that a significant part of that is what we would call traditional biomass. The most obvious use is hydro, of which Canada is particularly blessed by, some other countries. And these new renewables that tend to be discussed still have a long way to go, around 20 exajoules. This is a pygmy, but a pygmy that potentially has a very substantial role to play looking over a few generations. So let's run quickly through where these stand. If we look at nuclear, if we look at hydro, what we see here, technology that's not without its own environmental problems. It accounts for a significant part of, particularly of, as I've just said, of the renewables total. What's important here is that the major developments, if you look at the bottom left-hand corner here, is the particular role of new hydro plant in Asia and South America, very modest developments in Europe. So it's rather regionally focused at the moment. If we turn to biomass, this is a multiplicity of different, you look here, a multiplicity of different technologies. Electricity by burning biomass, bioethanol, biodiesel, combined heat and power systems. There are many options. I think it's fair to say the role that biomass plays is still pretty modest, although we've seen significant developments around bioethanol. With the one startling development, and that of course is bioethanol use in Brazil, which has been very successful, and examples of where it's very unsuccessful. Very high cost bioethanol from maize is really completely uneconomic. This is the example from the US. If we turn to wind, what we're looking here at a set of technologies that have grown, mechanical technologies that have grown rapidly, 27 to 28% per annum growth in wind turbines. It's a technology that begins to see some issues around cost. So we've seen these costs here in the case of the Danish very large wind program in Denmark, beginnings of some stabilization in cost reduction. You saw that, you might have noticed it on the other diagram. But this is one of the keystone technologies that will matter. This is one of the keystone technologies that will matter going forward with, as you can see, large scale increase in the size and also in the size of the arrays being used. If we turn to solar, most dramatic is this enormously vibrant set of technologies being developed, particularly when we look at multi-junction concentrators and silicon crystal applications. What we're looking at, this is from 1975 to 2010, but particularly here, large increases in potential efficiency, and in the middle, in some countries, solar will now compete with peak power costs, and we've seen absolutely dramatic development on the left-hand side around the world, with particular emphasis in China, now one of the great solar manufacturers, solar plant manufacturers, but also in places like Europe, partly as a consequence of feed-in tariff structures, and also in Japan. The growth rates have been dramatic, around 45% per annum in the last few years. So if we ask ourselves, where are we in terms of the size and role of renewables? Clean energy investments are running now at around $250 billion a year. The 2013 figure was some 254 billion. You can see the development here. So somewhere out here, 254 billion. What we've seen in the last 2 years is a retrenchment. If you go back to the peak figure in 2011, it was just over $300 billion. But this is a substantial sector and a significant portion of current overall investment in energy is into that area. To work, let's just remind ourselves of some of the challenges. This is maybe a typically weak, single week, 7 days situation where we have volatility around the wind load. You've got to be able to handle that in different ways. It's about energy storage, it's about connection to energy systems. But it is a challenge. If you take, for example, the developments of solar in Germany, which is substantial. This is an example of the seasonal change and output from solar PV. You've got to be able to handle large seasonal change, and that has very important implications for integration. So the integration of renewables is particularly important. And I won't go through all of these, but what's going to be one of the key deciders of whether renewables succeeds or does not succeed is going to be our ability to not just deploy these technologies, which are being deployed in some countries substantially, but also to do that in a way that ensures what we expect as the public from an energy system, that when you put your finger on the switch, the light actually goes on, and the sort of standards of supply that we're used to that can be met with these new systems. Just because we have large amounts of carbon in fossil fuels and we have potential limits on that, doesn't mean we don't have other options, of which perhaps the most substantial is carbon capture and storage. And I'm going to move through this little piece fairly quickly, given the time. But I think what's important to recognize is we've got a number of different ways which we can store carbon dioxide. There are practical and useful ways. We can use CO2 to assist us in accessing more oil and gas. It's acceptable. We can use it to flush out methane bed, coal bed methane, and then we can just simply store it in different geologies. We know from work around the world that much is possible. There's been a successful experience from pilot plants. The technology individually in parts is all understandable, and there's a pretty good chance that one could imagine applications. The big problem is a very simple problem, and it's the following. The price of carbon is very low. The present price of carbon, as of yesterday in Europe, was no more than around €5 a ton. We probably need substantially more. The reality is that carbon capture and storage reduces efficiencies and is highly costly, and that is a problem going forward. However, it doesn't mean that we may not begin to look seriously at it, but also it's still got a major set of local concerns. People are concerned about technologies, are mindful of nuclear, and are not comfortable about the idea of CO2 leakage and other issues. So there's a long way to bring this into the public domain if it's going to work. So let's move on to the challenge of climate policy. In many ways, it's inherently difficult. It's got vested interests who've got their own particular views. It has to be implemented by political systems that rarely have a long-term focus. There's a need for global action, but we don't have adequate global governance institutions. Public concern goes up and down depending on the economic state of the world. And when we look at the policies we need, it's easy to lay out what they are, but most politicians want to focus on non-compulsory, and public is, in places at times, concerned about compulsory limits around standards and control of emissions. Again, this is very regional. Position in Europe is different from the US, and maybe the Canadian position differs from the Chinese. So we've got a multiplicity of different views on this. What's clear going forward is that if we're going to make a serious inroad, and where there has been an inroad, is where politicians begin to focus on the making, where it is felt to be the case, politically acceptable. It needs a range of policies. They're around behavioral change, which is partly happening, and they're around corporate and social responsibility, which there are many examples of. They're around cities, for example, networks coming together and sharing policy examples. It's important to address the political issues. This is as much a question of being understood, and in view of many, the climate change scientists have not done a very good job of convincing public in many countries about the issue. It's about new ways of addressing energy policies and recognizing the multiple benefits and looking at policies which bring together the needs that we have across different energy areas like energy security, air pollution, health, climate change, to recognize that if you are clever enough, you can address all three at a much greater saving than if you address just single ones together. So if, for example, you wanted to address all three objectives across the world, the addition over climate change is fairly modest compared with the individual areas. But of course, the world doesn't work exactly like that. But it is important to demonstrate if you choose one set of options rather than another, you can solve some of the problem. In fact, solve all problems. So let me just talk about costs. We don't frankly know all of the investment costs, but the statistical side that we do know, which is the supply side and the classic energy industry, we spend around just over $1 trillion, and there's probably around another 300 billion on the demand side. And when we talk about individual countries, let me just give you a sense. If we take of China as an example, if we take today's investments, what we're looking at, if we have no sustainability policies, perhaps a doubling of that by 2050 on an annual basis. And if we look at the supply options, we're talking around 530 billion, a very substantial increase in investments. And equally, if we talk about the efficiency side, we have a very different structure here with a strong focus on large-scale investment around the demand side, the sort of issues I talked about when we talked about buildings, when we talked about individual areas. So let me, if we look, for example, at sub-Saharan Africa, where we have rather low levels of investment in energy, even with the current views of development, we're looking at around pretty much a 7.5-fold increase. And if we look at meeting this broader set of objectives, we're talking here in a supply world up to some $400 billion, and in an efficiency world around 300 plus. So I'm just going to bring this to a close now. I want to talk a little bit about energy access, which is a key issue that was discussed in this work. If we look at the world as a whole, around 3 billion people are without access to clean cooking, and just over 1.25 billion without access to any electricity. And if we look at the color coding here, you can see where the circles are placed. If we look at the code here, if we go from light to dark, over here from light to dark, going down here, we're looking at the number of people using solid fuels for cooking per square kilometer. And if we go from the colors from here from green to red, which is, if we go from green to red here, what we're looking at is the number of people who are without access. And look at the focus. The focus of where these problems are is essentially across significant parts of West and East Africa, particularly around northern India and across parts of Southeast Asia. So if we want to achieve universal access over a reasonable period, how might we do it? Well, a starting point is to look at the history of other nations. If we look at US and nation building over the period 1920 to 1960 here, we saw moving from around about 40% of the population in the 1920s to almost full electrification by the 1970s. And we saw Mexico follow the period 1960 to 2000. More recently, we've seen dramatic examples both in China and Brazil of moving towards full electrification. And even countries like South Africa and India are moving quickly. In particular, in the US, if we look at rural electrification, this took place really in really rapid haste following the Second World War. So it's quite possible once you get going to look at rapid electrification. And you can see Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia here moving over the last 20 years or so, particularly in South Asia, more rapidly. One of the questions raised was whether when we look at bringing the world to universal access within a period of just under 20 years, how feasible that would be. And it seems if you do the detailed country work, and you can look at this in the report, we're talking at a cost of around $40 to $60 billion a year. A lot of it would be locally generated, some of it under different schemes. But it's clear that this is possible. And if you compare it with some of the experiences I've just shown you. Policies, they need to be much more around integrating energy development with other development forms, reducing fossil fuel subsidies, aiding rapid development by some subsidies for the lowest income groups, building new off-grid systems, and making it attractive and helpful for others to invest. These objectives were laid out in the Sustainable Energy for All 2030 goals. You see them clearly there. And this work has been picked up as an integral part of the current UN program working with the World Bank and individual governments to focus on these objectives. And perhaps to conclude, the country involvement now is some 77 different countries are looking at their plans and looking at how they can achieve these sorts of objectives in their own context. So I think with that, let me finish and open the floor for any questions that you may have. Thank you. So I understand we have questions from the floor. If you want to either make a statement or you've got a question, could I ask you just to say a little bit about who you are and affiliation? And then we also have some online questions which we can throw up as we need to. So anybody want to jump into the first question?
Here.
If you would, please.
So my name is Robert Milligan. I live in this area since the 70s. I've been involved with the environment since the 60s. You could say I'm sort of a pioneering environmentalist. Question I have is, don't you think the world would be more behind your policies if they had a greater understanding of those processes that are going to lead to runaway climate change and runaway ocean change? The processes would include particularly, say, the accelerated warming of the Arctic. We can see from the melting of the ice, its acceleration there, the resulting warming of the Arctic Ocean, the release increasingly of methyl hydrates from the ocean, and also the warming of the permafrost is causing the release increasingly of methane and CO2. And these are processes we have to be very concerned about. I also worry about the degradation of the ocean, both from its increasing acidification and the changing of its chemical nature, so it's tending towards the only life that will thrive will be hydrogen sulfide producing bacteria, and we know about the dangers of hydrogen sulfide. And that's happening already, but it could really, really accelerate. So I worry about both. Do you?
Yeah, thank you. I may not have fully understood all of that. I didn't hear it clearly, so for the next question, I need to position myself to... Let me paraphrase a little bit. Is the concern around climate change, the sources of greenhouse gas emissions being substantially more than the energy system? And in particular, there are land use issues, but there are just simple processes going on in the way the planet works, which lead to greenhouse gas emissions. Is that the concern?
Yes.
I mean, I don't have any great problems with that. I think if you look at the reports, I think there are big question marks around that, and there are potentially great risks when you look at permafrost areas, if there is indeed an element of heating. I think it's probably fair to say that this sort of work, to the extent the climate change element is focused on, and particularly if you look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's work, which is different because it's primarily focused just on options for addressing climate change. It's clear that you need to move substantially beyond just the energy system. The energy system, you can do sums in different ways, may account for 2/3 greenhouse gas emissions. Land use issues are important. And then there are, of course, natural emissions. And I think the point is it may well be that we are bringing a disturbance to the climate system, which may involve important heating in certain areas. Certainly the evidence from the Arctic, the Antarctic, is that it may well be. It may well be that the history yet to be written about humanity from some time out there in the future.
So you need support, more support for the policies that you'd like to implement. Right now, there's forces, ideological, ones from the carbon industry and so on, who are mitigating against these policies, and the public's too naive, unfortunately, to really support you, and most corporations are naive. And somehow there has to be better information out there. The press is doing a sad job, unfortunately.
All that I can say is, in addressing such an uncommon problem, we have no genuine historical experience of how to address an issue as vast as the climate change issue. And therefore there's a lot of openness, a lot of interpretation around the science. And there's a lot of learning to be done. We've only been looking at the planet seriously, perhaps from the beginnings of as a planet, and planetary Earth sciences, from when satellites moved into space. So we have what, 2 generations of trying to understand a phenomenon which is substantial. Whether it's beyond us is a big question mark, but there's certainly a lot of people working on it, a lot of theories, a lot of ideas, proposals for solutions. And the energy system is a large part, but not the only part of that system. Could I turn to another question? If not, I can pick up an online question. Can we put that up here? So, are there existing institutions or groups that could evolve to play a stronger role in the global governance of energy? Well, I think, when it comes to the question of governance, I think the starting point is each one of us. And there are important groups which are almost entirely composed of independent individuals in the non-governmental organization area that have strong views about what we should and shouldn't do in this area. Even within individual countries, there's a wide variety of views as to the importance of the issue. But what's clear, because of the pervasive nature of energy, there's always an interest in energy. It may come from different parts of society, but energy is an important issue. The development of institutions to genuinely address the issue globally, we have a range of different institutions that address this individually, and also with a strong private sector in the context of strong state companies. And particularly when you move into the developing world, a lot of the big players are state organizations, and they, within reason, want to maintain their own freedom of movement. I think we're in the early days of building the relevant global institutions that will address energy concerns. I think at the moment we have to hope that the top 10, let's say the top 10 countries that matter in the world of energy can make the difference. And you need to include in there the serious players like China and India. It's not just the large developed countries. And in fact, when you look over time at where the significant increase in carbon emissions will come from, it's obviously going to come from those countries that are growing rapidly and have populations that want to be treated and to want to have the opportunities that they see in the developed world, or more to the point, that they see in their own cities. If you're moving from the countryside to the city or what have you, I think that matters. So this is not about a single silver bullet that somehow a global institution will arrive and solve it. It's going to have to be built piece by piece, and risks will need to be taken. And hopefully it's going to be based on sound analysis, which needs to be there if we're going to have a collective ownership of solving this problem. It's precisely the way we work in other areas where we can see joint interest. It can be as simple as civil aviation, where we have institutions like IATA that are concerned about the safety of aircraft, and it can be equally in other areas. The energy industry still has quite a long way to go to ensure that the attitudes that you see in an institution that will see its problems as problems wherever you are in the world, and to depoliticize it. We've got a major set of technical challenges here, not just political, social, ideological challenges, which also play an important role in addressing the issue. Any other questions and observations, please?
Yes, Carl Thompson, I live locally. Really just asking a question on behalf of my grandkids, who at the moment are quite young, but really the question here is the numbers that you show for various actions are really, I don't know whether you'd say very high or not, relatively speaking, but they seem very, very large. But for every dollar that is spent in this capacity, it creates a job and a new industry, which then people, it's a change of employment, not necessarily a loss of employment. So is there any way of estimating what the net cost in terms of reduction of lifestyle, or any way you want to pose it, will be to my grandkids' generation? Will it just be they're in an environment where there are different industries and different workers, or will they actually see a major change in their costs, in their lifestyle, perhaps offset by less air pollution and things like that? I'm just having the feeling that even if we spend all this money, it's not going to have a great effect on our lifestyle. We'll still be just about as good as we are now.
Well, let me again, I'll have to tell you what I thought I heard the question to be. Really, it's around the issue of energy developments changing lifestyle and the impact of lifestyle on energy use. It's absolutely clear that the lifestyles we need are not easily changed within a generation or two. I mean, put very simply, you buy a house in a particular location because the combination of the price of the house, the transport cost, there are norms that we set around how warm we like a place. There are all sorts of things in here. What can we learn from different studies and particular changes in attitudes and behaviors? We do know that there are people concerned in the large, it's not just the climate change issue, people are concerned about, in general, the damage to the environments they live in locally, and they want to see some solutions to that. It can be as simple as addressing air pollution problems on the Asian seaboard, which have, on average, levels which are 4 times what are considered to be acceptable by the WTO. It can be about fundamental changes in lifestyle that are a consequence of technology changes. What we see with the development of the various forms of computer, social media, digital options and possibilities, that the way people like to spend their time and the things that they want to do are different. Studies of individual groups in society highlight, for example, the millennials, particular generation, having a different set of values from their parents and others. In the extreme, lifestyles can be changed. I don't know whether energy is the major issue, but there's no doubt in a world, you take some European countries, where they don't have the benefits of Canada in terms of energy availability, and they haven't planned the new pipeline developments and other developments. You're looking at very large increases in cost. That is a major political issue. It affects the way people design and operate their lives. So increased energy costs change the way we do things. New technologies change it as well. And part of the aim of work like this is at least to make ourselves aware of what are the potential impact of those changes and consequences of lifestyle changes. To be frank, we do not know what 2050 will bring, but equally, to be frank, we can do work based on plausible assumptions to ask ourselves, are these worlds sensible, feasible? Would we want to live in them or not? That's part of the reason for doing this sort of work. It's 8:15. I think we have time for a few more questions. Is there anybody online who would like to throw up a question? If not, okay, please, if you would.
Yes, my name is Paul Enns. I'm a retired educator. You mentioned earlier in your presentation the number 2 degrees, and I've read this in other places. What is the significance of the 2 degrees as a benchmark? Like, where did that come from, and what are the implications of going beyond that?
I think it's an excellent question because, I mean, if you work in this area, numbers come and go. 2 degrees centigrade, I guess, has its root in the early analysis of what would be considered to be unacceptable degree of change, a degree of change in the average global temperature, which would mean that in some areas which are particularly likely to be hit around the tropics, they would have impacts on agriculture, increased desertification. You can go to the early studies, I guess, International Panel on Climate Change, maybe the second and third assessments bring that out. The reality at the moment, with the present state of pledges by governments, we're probably looking at between 3 to 4 degrees centigrade increase. If you look at work done in other areas, there are plausible futures based on essential inaction or not being prepared to act, but accepting this, that the science, as we understand it, is working properly, that could go up to 6 degrees centigrade. If you go into the report that was released this week, you'll see an interesting map showing what the consequences are. So this is, I think, fair to say, it's not so much arbitrary, but it is a judgment that's made, and it's an open judgment that's subject to debate. I think it's what's probably true is as soon as you get up to 4 or 5 or 6 degrees centigrade, that is extraordinary shift from the norms that we're used to. And the 2 degrees centigrade because that had become embedded. But it is an open question, and I'm absolutely sure that the collective action that's needed, to the extent we need to move substantially further from where we are, that 2 degrees centigrade will be a question, because the more fundamental issue is the following. How much will it cost us to address that? Can we afford it? Are we prepared to do it? And what are the costs of not addressing it? And that needs to be much more widely debated and a range of new options considered and given thought to. So, yeah, it's a good question, and I would be surprised, since we've seen norms shift about what's acceptable, that we're not dealing with some different set of objectives in debates in a few years' time. Let me be clear, there are people out there who say if you veer significantly away from 2 degrees centigrade, you will have problems. So it's not going to be a debate without both sides moving forward. Please, I think there's a...
Yes, my name is Ed Waters. I live in Waterloo. You assume that you're going to have a lot of solar energy in the future, and based on experience you have in Ontario, without storage, it's very expensive and not very reliable. You could use, if you use only solar, you could use your electricity only from 12 to 1. Right now we are paying about 85 cents per kilowatt, producing when we don't need it and selling in the United States for 5 cents per kilowatt.
I think, I can add other examples like that. The very large Danish wind turbine systems. Wind comes and goes whenever it chooses, not when we need it. And that is an issue. It works because it's linked into the Nord Pool system, where at times it's bought at negative cost. It's, in other words, you have to pay for the system to take it in. So what you've got behind that is real-time adjustment of prices. And you ask yourself, well, how do you resolve those problems? You resolve them in part by, it's going to be an element in here, more substantial set of energy storage systems. Secondly, you may need backup in some areas. You may need, just as we traditionally had when we had full load systems and peak power systems. Gas is in many areas a favored fuel. We need systems integration. Fortunately, quite a lot of the new technologies, digital technologies that develop, allow us to think electricity companies to think much more clearly about, we need more interconnection. So for these developments to take place, and one might add beyond that, we need perhaps some further improvements in the efficiency of solar. But as I showed, we've got big seasonal changes and we need to find adequate solutions for that. Having said that, we've seen large growths, really large growths in the application of PV, solar PV and others, and that's a momentum that's likely to continue. But not unless we solve the problems that you allude to. As I said earlier, I expect when I put my finger on that switch, those lights go on. And you have to do that with a different supply system. It's challenging. Is it insurmountable? Probably not. A lot of companies, Siemens is an example, but you could choose many others, that are working on the management and development of integrated local distribution systems, which might include large numbers of solar, wind turbines, and then you need other elements to ensure you have the confidence that the electricity will flow.
So basically you assume that you have a storage, because without storage, solar is not very practical right now.
It's increasingly practical in the sense it's been growing at 45% per annum, and you've had large industries develop in places like China and parts of Europe, and not to say that companies like GE that bought out the original Enron wind turbine system company are also doing really quite good business. So the combination of wind and solar in many places, it poses, I think the point, it poses big problems. manageability, and that doesn't mean it won't happen. These are within the realms of solution. Thank you. Let me take another question from outside. The Gaia final report was launched at Rio+20. That is indeed correct. Do you see a need for this type of event on an annual or ongoing basis to raise awareness and encourage collaboration? I think the set of issues raised at Rio+20 are probably not things that you don't need perhaps such a convention every year. To some extent, we have an ongoing set of conventions on the web with a lot of discussion and reports. I think what's important is where action makes a difference, there's a need, can make a difference, there's a need for continual reflection. Just to take the last question, there are technology concerns and issues, and they get resolved over time, but new issues arise. And I think that's valuable. I think raising awareness and encouraging collaboration are fundamental issues, but they need to be done, I think, personally, in a spirit that recognizes we want to ensure that views are reasonably sound, that analysis has at least gained the benefit of critique and comment from others. I have one other question. What is the cost for the individual for the paradigm shift? I wonder whether any of us actually want to bear any cost for any paradigm shift. I think what's important is that it's very clear that there are significant generational differences in what's acceptable and what are seen as social norms. Maybe fortunately, we pass on, as it were, and others have to address this issue. But I think there are important differences in norms both across countries and across generations. And to be frank, this is an issue that's going to play out this century. And the responsibility for finding the relevant solutions lies with the new generations moving towards leadership. Let's hope they can handle that well. So with that, I think it might be time to close and pass back to my good friend.
A few quick comments before we adjourn. First of all, thank you, Jed, for your lecture this evening, for condensing the work of 302 researchers and 5.5 kilograms of paper into one clear presentation. You saved us a lot of reading and energy. You walked us into the distant future, the year 2100 and beyond. No oil, less coal, more wind and sun power. And when we push the switch, the lights still come on. But obviously, the technical and political issues are large and challenging. This report is a call to global action. Let's hope that we don't leave everything to the next generation, but that the people here and now today take action. Thank you very much for your stirring comments. The edited video of tonight's webcast will be posted to the CIGI website, and we'll post a blog where you can add your own comments. Our next public event in this auditorium is coming up quickly. On Monday, April 7th, we resume our CIGI Cinema series with a screening of Earth Made of Glass. This is a film that marks the 20-year anniversary of the genocide in Rwanda. Visit cgionline.org to reserve your seat for this event and register for our events newsletter so you get information on all of our upcoming lectures and films. Thank you for coming to CIGI this evening, and have a safe journey home.
Created policy-relevant analysis. It recognized right at the outset the multiple objective challenge of dealing with energy. When you make a decision that addresses, for example, a power plant decision, be it coal or gas, and be it increasingly maybe a set of wind turbines or perhaps solar plants. Every time you make a decision which might be related to achieving security, it affects pollution in the system, the cost of the system. It affects questions of affordability, a range of issues. So we have here a quite complex set of issues. Particular focus was around the energy and sustainability challenges that energy poses. In a world which is changing dramatically its set of options for technology and reassessing continuously the fundamental resource base. It's a world in which even the demand and supply fundamentals are changing, particularly on the demand side, as new technologies allow us to use energy more economically, allow us to open up possibilities which we would not have thought of even a decade or two ago in terms of use, be it electric vehicles, be it other possibilities. It's a world that's beginning to get into a fundamental set of new systemic issues. How do we handle large-scale off-grid systems? If we have a system of energy supply which is built around intermittent sources, what sort of storage is needed? How do we control in real time these sort of systems integration issues? And finally, we will look at the possible futures, learn a little bit about how the world might be to help inform us about policy options in the present, and look much more carefully at intelligent options going forward. The output of the work, and what we see here is a table of contents. It's a large piece of work. It's built around what we call 4 knowledge clusters. You can see them here in cluster 1, 2, 3, and 4. Initially, cluster 1 is dealing very much with the nature and magnitude of the challenges and expresses them in terms of specific numbers. So you'll see, excuse me, danger of pressing the laser pointer. So you can see here the challenges. They're around health and security, issues of economy, energy and environment, issues of poverty and development. Secondly, what we're dealing with are the existing and future resource and technology options. Our ability to address these issues obviously depends on the tools that we have available. And here we're dealing with a wide range of issues. I'm not going to go through them in detail here because I'm going to cover quite a few of these as we go forward. Thirdly, there's a synthesis section. Having got this information out, what we're looking at here is their integration. And this includes not just energy, but will necessarily touches on issues of land use, water, urbanization, lifestyles, and then looking at the possible future pathways that we need to think about in looking at the consequence of policy and possibilities. And finally, if we go towards the end, a series of chapters that deal with our analysis of existing policies and new policies needed to address the challenges we have at the moment. This is an ambitious document led by a group of some 25 experts from around the world, included, in fact, here from Canada, Mark Jaccard, head of the Policy for Energy System Transformations at Simon Fraser. But what we had was a wide set of experts. This 25 had on average teams of around 12 and labored on this for a number of years before the work was completed. The aim was to get not just competence, but to recognize we needed a degree of diversity in the groups involved. And although you see a significant emphasis on OECD, increasingly we're looking at non-OECD involvement. And in a way, this was a more than adequate reflection of the available expertise globally on addressing energy. So if we just close a little bit on a few points on this work. It was not just a report, a rather large report. It weighs around 5.5 kilos, some 1,850 documents. The good news that every single chapter is downloadable separately, and more importantly, for those who are involved in doing analytical work, a large database is accessible and usable for those people who want to dig deeper into the work. The whole idea was to have elements of an open source structure for this work. Secondly, there's a series of policy tools which allow policies to be constructed and examined, looking at trade-offs between different issues. If you don't want to do anything, say, in addressing resilience issue and security, or you think climate change is not a concern, you can play with this to look at different policy sets and policy options. And it's a little bit like doing test work before you get a study. There is a study which perhaps less seen but important on the International Assessment of Agricultural Knowledge, Science and Technology. And the Global Energy Assessment is such a creature. It involves a large-scale set of teams working for many years, trying to provide at least a comprehensive and collective set of insights around a subject area which matters in quite significant ways. It has a number of unique elements. It is not intergovernmental in the sense that every word is agreed by governments. It's much more a peer-reviewed exercise, which is quite unique. Every single chapter is reviewed by a peer group. So overall in this work, there were some 300 researchers worldwide and 200 reviewers. And secondly, its uniqueness derives from the fact that it is normative in nature. It's trying to ask the question, if we want to manage energy intelligently through this century, whether it's the issue of security of energy supply, affordability, whether we're dealing with the issues around climate change, addressing the issues of air pollution and energy access for all, what really is the information we need, the knowledge we need to provide a sound foundation for intelligent decision-making? So that was really the objective. Overriding or acting as the sort of senior governance group was a set of people deliberately selected to provide some balance between the developed and the developing world. Two co-presidents, one from Europe, the other from Brazil. A range of governments, international institutions, and representatives from a diverse set of countries, be it China, be it Austria, and so on. This information you can look at your leisure. It was funded, significant funding from a range of governments here, particularly a set of international institutions and a number of companies like First Solar, Petrobras in Brazil, and supported by the World Energy Council and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, which are both organizations with substantial private sector involvement. Let me say a little bit about what are the key features of this work. It was conducted very much in the mode of scientific analysis. It was science-based, comprehensive, integrated.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Center for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI as we say. My name is Fred Kuntz, and I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs here at CIGI. I'd like to thank our public event sponsors, Wordsworth Books, for their ongoing support of CIGI's signature lecture series. Thanks also to those joining us from around the world through our live webcast this evening. Following the address, we welcome questions from both audiences here at CG at the microphones on either side of the aisle, or from our online audience through the chat function on your screen. Please remember to state your name and to keep the questions brief. Here in Canada, after a winter of record-breaking lows and a snowy start to spring, we've all developed a deep appreciation for our electricity and gas providers. It's hard to imagine life without certainty of energy to meet our basic needs, including heat. Tonight, our speaker looks beyond Western borders to consider energy challenges and opportunities in developing countries, where clean and abundant energy is not a sure thing. Professor Gerald or Jed Davis is the chair of the World Energy Scenario Study Group, as well as president and CEO of Foreseen. He's been a strong proponent for the development and use of global scenarios to help develop policies for the future. He holds an undergraduate degree in mining engineering from Imperial College in London, as well as postgraduate degrees in economics and engineering from the London School of Economics and Stanford University, respectively. Please join me in welcoming tonight's special guest, Jed Davis.
Well, first, let me thank you for those kind words. It's tremendous to be here. Every time I come through Waterloo, there's something new. Is get this sense of change and excitement, and it's a good place to be. So what I'd like to do is, over the next 50 minutes or so, give you a sense of this exercise, the Global Energy Assessment, why I believe it's important, and really what it's about, the highlights, and some of the consequences of it. Let me first talk a little bit about the word assessment. We don't have a lot of experience doing large-scale assessments. We have the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Some of you may have seen some of the results from Working Group 2, the 5th assessment, which is really beginning to report at the moment. We do have, besides the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which was looking at biodiversity in the longer term. Again, a major involved in making decisions. 300 authors, 200 reviewers, cost around €6 million, and a large document, but as I say, importantly, if you go to the website at the top here, that website, www.globalenergyassessment.org, you can download just about everything with respect to the report. So let me turn now to the content. When we talk about the global energy goal, we're looking here at addressing climate change, at the time focusing on what needed to be done to limit mean temperature rise to 2 degrees centigrade, looking at improving energy security across countries, eliminating air pollution, health damages, providing universal access to affordable clean cooking and electricity for the poor. In effect, a rather wide range of goals here. And it's perhaps worth reminding ourselves where the global energy system has come from. It doesn't stay the same. It changes, and it changes radically as our technology sets change, the costs of extraction and use of energy changes, and it changes as our resource base shifts and changes. If you go back to the middle of the 19th century, what we see here is the development and beginnings, perhaps going back some distance, but the steam engine was a significant and dominant tool. It was really towards the end of the 19th century that we began to develop the electric motor and the gasoline engine, and we've seen other developments through the vacuum tube, commercial aviation, nuclear, the microchip. And what we've seen is a gradual shift in energy use from carbon intensity, carbon intense wood and then coal, right through to crude oil becoming significant and its products. Coal as a share began to peak in the 1920s, oil in the 1960s, 70s, and we've seen a substantial growth in gas and, of course, a growth in nuclear with its problems, and a fairly modest role for renewables. This is where we've come from. This is the picture that's probably worth at some point to keep in one's head. So all of the variety of energy use that you see if you look at the way energy is used around the world is embedded in a way in that particular diagram. So let me talk a little bit about, in rather general terms,